Hey guys, tonight we step into the shadows of late medieval England, a mesmerizing 200-year saga where devastating plagues, ruthless kings, and bloody rebellions accidentally forged the modern world. What if I told you that the English language you are listening to right now, the birth of the middle class, and the very roots of modern freedom weren't created by peaceful treaties, but were violently hammered out during an apocalyptic era that saw half the population wiped out and kings slaughtered by their own families? And before we dive in, I'm genuinely curious, what city, what time is it there? Drop it in the comments, I read every single one, and your stories always make my night. Close your eyes, settle in, let the noise of your day fade away. Listen to the wind howling off the Irish Sea, feel the damp, bone-chilling cold of a medieval winter. It is the end of the 13th century. The world is lit only by the flickering glow of hearth fires and tallow candles, and in the heart of this shadowy world sits a king. His name is Edward I. They call him Longshanks. He is a man of towering height, a man with a mind as sharp and unforgiving as a steel blade, and he has a vision, a grand, terrifying vision. He looks at the fractured, mist-shrouded lands of the British Isles, and he sees only one thing. He sees a single realm. He sees an island, united under his crown. But unity, in the Middle Ages, is never born from peaceful handshakes. It is born from blood. It is born from iron. And it is bought with staggering amounts of silver. Let us travel to Wales. The mountains of Gwynedd. For centuries, the Welsh have fiercely guarded their independence. They are a proud people, rooted in ancient Celtic traditions, hiding in the crags and deep valleys where English cavalry cannot reach them. But Edward is not like the kings who came before him. He is patient. He is methodical. In 1282, the Welsh leader, Llywelyn, falls in battle, and with his death, a 200-year struggle begins to collapse. Edward does not just defeat the Welsh, he suffocates them. He brings down the hammer. Imagine the sheer scale of it. Over the next 2 decades, the king pours rivers of wealth into the rugged Welsh landscape. He imports skilled stonemasons, carpenters, and desperate labourers from every single county in England. They are put to work in the freezing rain, hauling massive blocks of limestone. Between 1277 and 1301, Edward spends at least £75,000. Let that sink in for a moment. In a world where a highly skilled stonemason earns less than 2 shillings for an entire week of back-breaking labour, £75,000 is a virtually incomprehensible fortune. It is an economic hemorrhage. And what does this fortune buy? It buys a ring of stone, massive, imposing fortresses, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech. These are not just military bases, they are psychological weapons. They are physical manifestations of English tyranny, casting long, dark shadows over the conquered Welsh lands. The Welsh are pacified, yes. A new government is set up. English immigrants are moved into walled towns, safe behind the battlements. By 1301, Edward takes the conquered principality and hands it to his eldest son, naming him the very first English Prince of Wales. It is a brilliant, permanent political manoeuvre. But beneath the surface, the resentment boils. The Celtic prejudice against the English deepens into a bitter, generational trauma. The conquerors and the conquered live side by side, locked in a tense, silent hatred. A shadow has fallen over the mountains, and shadows, as we will see, have a way of spreading. Edward's eyes soon turn northward, towards the rugged highlands and cold borders of Scotland. Scotland is different. It is a sovereign kingdom. It has its own royal family, the Camories. Its people are fiercely independent, but in 1286, tragedy strikes. King Alexander III dies. 4 years later, his young granddaughter and heir also passes away. The Scottish throne is empty. The realm is teetering on the edge of civil war. In desperation, the Guardians of Scotland invite King Edward to act as an arbitrator, to help them choose their next king. It is a fatal mistake. You do not invite a wolf to settle a dispute among sheep. Edward uses this opportunity, this great cause, to assert himself not as an ally, but as the overlord of Scotland. He demands their submission. He demands their obedience. But the Scots do not break easily. They are not fighting for territory. They are fighting for survival. They reach out to France, forging an alliance in 1295 that will plague England for generations. The Cold War begins. It is a brutal, grinding conflict of attrition. English armies march north, establishing fragile, isolated military outposts in the Scottish lowlands. But the supply lines are impossibly long. The land is hostile. The locals are armed and angry. A Scottish knight named William Wallace rises from the heather. He bleeds the English. He outsmarts them. He strikes terror into the occupying forces until he is captured and brutally executed in 1305. But killing a man does not kill a rebellion. Then comes Robert the Bruce, a king in his own right. He inspires a fierce, burning patriotism. He understands the land. He knows that heavy English war horses are useless in the treacherous bogs and deep mud of the north. In 1314, at a place called Bannockburn, the myth of English invincibility is shattered. The heavy English cavalry, the pride of the realm, is decimated by the agile, spear-wielding Scottish skiltrons. It is a humiliation that will echo through the halls of Westminster for decades. This endless war, this desperate attempt to forge an empire on an island, is draining the lifeblood of England. War requires men, and war requires money. In the late 13th century, the English government is pushed to its absolute limits. To fund his campaigns in Wales, in Scotland, and in his territories in France, Edward I turns on his own people. He becomes ruthless. He levies crushing taxes on the wealthy merchants. He squeezes the landowners. He demands heavy subsidies from the church. The financial burden in the 1290s is 4 times higher than it was in the early years of his reign. Imagine being a merchant in London, or a sheep farmer in the quiet hills of the Cotswolds. The king is constantly dipping into your pockets to pay for castles you will never see and wars you do not care about. He seizes merchant ships, disrupting the vital trade routes to the continent. He drags young men from their ploughs to die in the freezing Scottish rain. The kingdom begins to crack under the pressure. The powerful barons, the great magnates of the realm, start to push back. They dust off a document from a century earlier, Magna Carta. They use it as a shield, arguing against taxation without representation. They demand rights. They demand limits on the king's absolute power. The relationship between the crown and the subjects, the delicate balance that keeps a nation from tearing itself apart, is severely damaged. A profound crisis of trust infects the government. In the summer of 1307, Edward I, the Great Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, marches north for the final time. He is old, he is sick, but his will is unbroken. On July the 7th, as he prepares to cross the Solway Firth into Scotland, his body finally gives out. He dies in the arms of his attendants. He leaves behind an exhausted, heavily taxed nation. He leaves behind an unwinnable war in the north, a simmering resentment in the west, and a political powder keg in London. He leaves the crown to his son, Edward II, a man who possesses none of his father's brilliance, but all of his stubbornness. The stage is set for disaster. The hammer has struck the anvil, but the sparks are about to set the entire kingdom ablaze. And as the 14th century dawns, the people of England have no idea that the wars of kings will soon be the least of their worries, because something much darker and much more silent is preparing to wash upon their shores. Chapter 2. The Chivalric Illusion. The dusk of the early 14th century settled heavily over England. The reign of Edward II had ended not in battlefield glory, but in tears, humiliation, and a forced abdication. A king had been broken by his own barons. The myth of absolute, untouchable royal authority was shattered. But out of this political wreckage, a new architect of power emerged. In 1327, a 15-year-old boy assumed the throne. His name was Edward III. And unlike his father, he understood the fundamental rule of power. To control a fractured, restless elite at home, you must point their aggression outward. You must give them a shared enterprise, a common enemy, a grand, unified dream of wealth and glory. And Edward looked across the narrow sea. He looked at France. To understand what happens next, we have to look past the velvet cloaks and the shining crowns. We have to look at the medieval economy. We have to look at the money. England's true wealth was not in its gold reserves. It was walking on 4 legs across the gentle rolling hills of the Cotswolds, and the sprawling estates of the great abbeys. Sheep. By the early 1300s, there were up to 18 million sheep in England. They produced the finest, most sought-after wool in all of Europe. This wool was the lifeblood of the realm. It was exported to the wealthy weaving cities of Flanders, turning raw fleece into vast fortunes for English merchants and the crown. At the same time, England held one precious, lucrative territory on the European mainland, Gascony, in the southwest of France. Gascony was a gold mine of vineyards. Ships left English ports loaded with wool and corn, and returned from Bordeaux heavy with dry, rich wine. It was a perfect, highly profitable trade loop. But the French monarchy, proud, centralising, and increasingly powerful, wanted Gascony back. They wanted to squeeze the English out. For years, it was a diplomatic Cold War, tariffs, border skirmishes, political posturing. And then, the French royal line, the ancient House of Capet, ran out of male heirs. 4 kings died in rapid succession. The throne of France was suddenly empty. Edward III had French royal blood through his mother. And in 1337, as tensions over the Gascon wine trade and the Flanders wool routes reached a boiling point, Edward made a staggering, audacious move. He didn't just ask for secure trade routes, he claimed the French crown itself. He declared himself the rightful king of France. It was the ultimate hostile takeover bid, and it ignited a conflict that would drag on for more than a century. We call it the 100 Years' War. But war on this scale is an incredibly expensive enterprise. Edward was betting the entire economy of England on this venture. He taxed the merchants, he leveraged the wool trade, he borrowed astronomical sums from international Italian bankers in London, treating the English economy like a high-stakes hedge fund. He needed to yield a return on this massive investment, and he did it by unleashing a profound disruption in military technology. Forget the romantic paintings of chivalrous knights clashing with swords. The reality of Edward's war was industrial. It was brutal, and it was built on the shoulders of the common working man. Enter the English longbow. Imagine a piece of yew wood taller than a man. It takes immense, almost unnatural physical strength to draw the string back to the ear. The men who wielded these bows were not aristocrats. They were labourers, farmers, and tradesmen from the shires of England and the hills of Wales. They had trained since childhood, their skeletons literally adapting and warping from the years of drawing the heavy draw weights. In the medieval hierarchy, a fully armoured French knight was a walking fortune. His plate armour, his specially bred warhorse, his lifelong martial training, he was the equivalent of a modern, multi-million-dollar battle tank. He was the unquestioned master of the battlefield, until he met the longbow. Picture the scene. August 1346. The fields of Crécy in northern France. The English army is outnumbered, exhausted, and cornered. The sky darkens. A sudden, violent summer rainstorm turns the ploughed earth into thick, heavy mud. Then, the sun breaks through the clouds, shining directly into the eyes of the advancing French army. The flower of French nobility, thousands of knights wrapped in steel, adorned in silk surcoats, begins their massive, thunderous charge. The ground shakes beneath the hooves of their war horses. They ride with absolute certainty in their noble superiority. On the ridge above them, the English men-at-arms have dismounted. They stand shoulder to shoulder with the common archers. Edward gives the order. Thousands of bowstrings snap forward in perfect unison. It sounds like the tearing of canvas. A dark cloud of arrows rises into the sky, pausing for a heartbeat at the apex of its arc, before raining down with terrifying kinetic energy. Skilled archers can fire up to 12 arrows a minute. The sky goes dark with them. They fall like deadly hail. The heavy bodkin points, designed specifically to pierce armour, punch through the French steel. The result is absolute carnage. The proud French cavalry is broken before they even reach the English lines. Horses scream and collapse in the mud. Knights are pinned to the ground, crushed under the weight of their own falling comrades. In a matter of hours, the myth of the invincible aristocratic knight is slaughtered by the disciplined, relentless mechanics of commoners. Crécy is a total, earth-shattering victory for the English. Under Finer, 10 years later, the nightmare repeats itself. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, it is Edward's eldest son leading the army. Edward of Woodstock. History remembers him as the Black Prince. The Black Prince is a master of the chevauchée. a ruthless, highly mobile cavalry raid designed to burn crops, sack towns, and completely destroy the economic foundation of the French countryside. It is economic warfare at its most terrifying. At Poitiers, the English trap the French army again, and this time they achieve the impossible. In the bloody chaos of the battlefield, they capture the French king himself. King John II is taken prisoner. Pi. Imagine the shockwaves. The CEO of the rival empire is now a hostage in London. The geopolitical and financial dividends are staggering. The English demand a ransom for the French king that defies belief. 3 million gold crowns. It is a sum so massive it literally bankrupts the French state and forces them to mint a new currency just to pay the installments. For a brief, shining moment, the English gamble pays off. The wealth flowing across the Channel is unimaginable. Successful soldiers return to the English shires carrying silver plates, fine tapestries, and the deeds to conquered French estates. The royal court in London throws lavish tournaments, drowning in the profits of war. Edward III and the Black Prince are hailed as the greatest commanders since King Arthur. They embody the absolute pinnacle of chivalric glory. They establish the Order of the Garter, celebrating brotherhood, honour, and martial prowess. It is a beautiful, intoxicating illusion, but an illusion is all it is. Because beneath the glittering surface of captured gold and tournament pageantry, the fundamental machinery of the English state is grinding itself to dust. War is a hungry beast. Even with the ransoms and the plunder, the cost of maintaining permanent garrisons in France, of constantly shipping men and horses across the sea, is draining the treasury. The burden falls, as it always does, on the quiet, forgotten people in the background. The coastal towns of southern England live in constant fear of retaliatory French and Castilian naval raids. Ports are burned, merchant ships are seized by the government, completely halting normal trade. The Parliament, the Assembly of Merchants, Knights, and local gentry begins to ask dangerous questions. They hold the purse strings. They are the ones being heavily taxed to fund these endless overseas adventures, and they are tired of it. They begin to demand audits. They demand accountability from the king's ministers. The seeds of parliamentary oversight are being watered by the exorbitant costs of war. As the years bleed into decades, the golden era begins to tarnish. The brilliant victories of the early years become distant memories. The French change their tactics. They refuse to fight pitched battles. They wage a slow, agonizing war of attrition, starving the English out of their strongholds. And the heroes of the age begin to fade. The Black Prince, exhausted by years of harsh campaigning, contracts a debilitating illness. He returns to England a shadow of his former self, his health broken, his temper volatile. Edward III, the once glorious warrior king, descends into senility, manipulated by self-serving courtiers. The great financial and military enterprise is stalling. The endless taxes continue, but the victories have stopped. A deep, restless anxiety settles over the English countryside. The people are working harder, paying more, and seeing nothing but loss in return. The fabric of society is stretched incredibly thin. The gap between the wealthy lords hoarding war profits and the struggling peasants has never been wider. The tension is palpable. You can feel it in the air. A static charge waiting for a spark. But the spark that is about to ignite England will not come from a French sword, or a rebellious baron, or a tax collector. It will come from a rat. While the English are fixated on their wars of succession and their economic manoeuvring, a silent, invisible tide is moving across Europe. It has crossed the Mediterranean. It has swept through Italy and France. And now it is in the holds of the merchant ships sailing toward the sleepy ports of Dorset. The grand games of kings and knights are about to become entirely irrelevant, because nature is about to step onto the chessboard, and it is about to wipe the pieces clean. Chapter 3. The Great Mortality. Let us step away from the battlefields of France. Let us leave behind the charging knights, the showers of arrows, and the glittering ransoms of kings. We are returning to England. It is the summer of 1348. The air is thick and uncomfortably warm. The ports along the southern coast are bustling with merchant galleys arriving from the continent. They carry wine from Gascony, fine cloth from Flanders, and exotic spices from the Mediterranean. But deep within the dark, damp holds of these wooden ships, hiding among the cargo, is an invisible conqueror. a stowaway that cares nothing for royal bloodlines, chivalric honour, or the wealth of nations. It travels in the blood of black rats, more specifically, in the stomachs of the fleas that feed on them. At the time, they did not call it the Black Death. That is a name invented by historians centuries later. To the people who lived through it, who watched their world dissolve into a terrifying nightmare, it was simply known as the Great Mortality. Imagine you are living in a small, crowded coastal town in Dorset. It begins as a rumour, whispers from sailors of a terrible pestilence wiping out the cities of Italy and France. You listen, but it feels far away, a tragedy for someone else. Then, your neighbour falls ill. It starts with a sudden, shivering fever. Then comes the agonising pain in the joints. Within a day, dark, swollen lumps, buboes, the size of apples, appear on the neck, the armpits, and the groin. The pain is so severe that victims fall into a delirium, crying out to God for a mercy that does not come. Dark patches spread across the skin as internal bleeding begins. Within 3 to 5 days, they are dead. The speed of it is paralysing. It defies all medical understanding of the age. There is no cure. There is no treatment. There is only an overwhelming absolute terror. A priest in Oxfordshire, a man named Geoffrey Le Baker, watches the horror unfold and records it for history. He writes about how the plague nearly annihilates the seaports of Dorset before creeping inland. It sweeps into Devon and Somerset, racing toward the great western port of Bristol. Panic sets in. The people of Gloucester, terrified of the invisible miasma, barricade their gates. They refuse to let anyone from Bristol enter, convinced that even the breath of those from infected towns carries the shadow of death. But wooden gates and stone walls cannot stop a plague carried by fleas and rats. Gloucester falls, then Oxford, then London. By the winter, the entire realm is consumed. The sheer mathematics of the Great Mortality are almost impossible to comprehend. Try to picture your neighbourhood, your family, your circle of friends. Now, imagine that within a matter of months, 1 out of every 3 people you know simply ceases to exist. In some villages, the death toll is closer to 50%. There are too many bodies and not enough living hands to bury them. Consecrated graveyards overflow. The authorities are forced to purchase open farmland just to dig massive trench graves, laying the dead side by side, stacked like cordwood, covered only by a thin layer of earth. Countless commoners, monks, nuns, and priests vanish from the earth. The plague is brutally democratic. It strikes the young and the strong with a terrifying ferocity. The very fabric of society begins to unravel. Entire settlements are wiped clean, their thatched roofs rotting, their hearths growing cold, leaving nothing but silent, empty ruins dotting the English countryside. We call them the Lost Villages. For a year, the plague ravages the island, and just as suddenly as it arrived, it begins to recede. When the survivors finally emerge from their homes, blinking in the sunlight, they step into a world that is profoundly, irrevocably changed. A heavy, haunting silence hangs over the fields. But this is not just a story of an apocalypse. This is a story of rebirth, because out of this unimaginable tragedy, the modern economic world begins to take its very first, trembling steps. To understand why, you have to understand the invisible chains that bound the medieval peasant. For centuries, the system of feudalism relied on a brutal economic reality. There were too many people, and not enough land. Before the plague, the population of England had peaked at perhaps 4 million. Because labour was cheap and plentiful, wages were kept at starvation levels. A skilled carpenter might earn 3 pence for a gruelling day's work. A common labourer earned barely a penny. They were serfs, tied to the land, entirely at the mercy of wealthy lords and abbots who controlled the food supply in the courts. But the Great Mortality shattered that equation overnight. When the harvest season of 1349 arrives, the great lords look out over their vast golden fields of wheat and realise a terrifying truth. There is no one left to swing the scythes. Suddenly, the power dynamic is flipped entirely upside down. The law of supply and demand violently asserts itself. Labour, the sweat and muscle of the common man, is suddenly the most valuable commodity in the kingdom. Imagine being a surviving peasant. You have spent your entire life being told you are the lowest rung on the social ladder. But now, The lord of the manor is desperate. His crops are rotting in the fields. His sheep are wandering aimlessly without shepherds. So, you look the lord in the eye, and you demand double the wages. And because he has no choice, he pays it. For the first time in English history, the working class holds the leverage. Wages skyrocket. Agricultural workers see their pay jump higher than ever before. Even women, hired to bring in the harvest, find themselves demanding and receiving equal pay to men, simply because a pair of working hands is worth its weight in gold. Peasants begin to break the ancient bonds of serfdom. If a lord refuses to pay a higher wage, the peasant simply packs his bags in the middle of the night and walks to the next village, knowing the neighbouring lord will gladly pay him to work his empty fields. This is the silent revolution of the 14th century. It is the birth of social mobility. The rigid, oppressive system of high farming, where lords directly manage massive estates for high profits, collapses. The cost of labour is simply too high. To avoid financial ruin, the great landowners are forced to change their entire business model. They stop farming the land themselves and begin leasing it out in large blocks to the most ambitious and enterprising peasants. These peasants take the land, they save their newfound wealth, they begin to lend money to their neighbours. They stop living in miserable mud huts and, for the first time, begin building solid stone houses in the south and east of England. They are eating better meat. They are drinking better ale. They are wearing finer clothes. When you read Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales written later in this century, you don't read about miserable, starving serfs. You read about a society of millers, merchants, and landowners who are confident, loud, and full of life. You are looking at the ancestors of the English middle class, but those in power do not give up their privilege quietly. The aristocracy and the government are absolutely horrified by this shift in wealth. They look at peasants demanding higher wages and wearing nice clothes, and they see it as an offence against the natural order of the universe. King Edward III and his parliament try to turn back the clock. In 1351, they pass the Statute of Labourers. It is a desperate piece of legislation attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and physically restrict the movement of the working class. It essentially says, you will work for the old penny and you will stay where you are told, but you cannot legislate against the laws of economics, and you cannot put a newly freed people back into a cage. The landlords try to enforce these laws. Some of the more conservative landowners, like the Abbot of St Albans, resort to extortion and violence to squeeze their tenants. They use the local courts to punish workers who demand fair pay. This creates a slow-burning friction across the shires. The peasants are growing wealthier, yes, but they are also growing increasingly aware of their own worth. They are becoming literate. They are beginning to question why a few hundred aristocratic families should own the entire country, while the people who bleed into the soil are treated like criminals for asking for a living wage. The Great Mortality cleared the board. It broke the back of feudalism. It gave the common people a taste of prosperity and freedom. But the lords are pushing back, trying to tighten the chains just as the people have learned to slip out of them. The tension is building in the taverns, in the fields, and in the village squares. The plague may have passed, but a different kind of fever is taking hold. A fever of defiance. And it is only a matter of time before that defiance erupts into an inferno that will threaten to burn the entire English establishment to the ground. Chapter 4. The Fire in the Shires. The glow of the Black Prince's victories has long faded. The gold ransoms from France are gone, spent on lavish tournaments, failed campaigns, and the glittering hollow courts of Westminster. It is the 1370s, and the great war machine is breaking down. The French have changed their strategy. They are no longer fighting chivalrous battles in open fields. They are launching devastating raids on the southern coast of England. English ports are burning. The English Channel, once a moat of safety, feels terrifyingly vulnerable. And the heroes are dead. The Black Prince, the darling of the nation, wastes away from disease and dies in 1376. The following year, the great king, Edward III, the man who started it all, who commanded armies and captured kings, dies a frail, senile old man. The crown of England descends to the Black Prince's only surviving son, Richard II. Richard is 10 years old. For the second time since the Norman conquest, a child sits on the throne, and around this child circles a court of ambitious, wealthy, and deeply unpopular uncles and aristocrats. The most powerful among them is John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. a man whose vast wealth is only matched by the sheer hatred the common people feel for him. The government is desperate, the war is a bottomless pit, and the treasury is empty. They cannot tax the wool trade anymore without breaking it. They cannot squeeze the great landowners, because the landowners are the ones running the government. So, they look downward. They look at the peasants, the artisans, the labourers who have slowly been building their wealth since the Black Death. The government decides to implement a new kind of tax, not a tax on property, not a tax on goods, a tax on existence. They call it the poll tax. In 1377 they charge 4 pence for every adult in the kingdom. In 1379 they charge it again. The people call this second one the evil subsidy. But the government is blind to the mood of the country. They are completely disconnected from the reality of the shires. In 1381 they push too far. They demand a third poll tax. This time the rate is 1 shilling per head, 3 times the amount of the previous taxes. To a wealthy merchant, a shilling is nothing. To a labourer, it is days of wages. It is the difference between eating and starving. And this tax does not care if you are a duke or a ditch digger. Everyone pays the same. It is a breathtakingly regressive, arrogant piece of legislation. The people do not just grumble this time. They evade the tax collectors. They hide their families. When the royal commissioners ride out into the villages of East Anglia, Essex and Kent to enforce the collection, they are not met with bowed heads. They are met with pitchforks, longbows and cold hard stares. The spark catches in late May, 1381. In a small village in Essex, a royal justice arrives to punish those who refuse to pay. The villagers surround him. They tell him, in no uncertain terms, that they will not pay another penny. When the justice orders his guards to arrest the leaders, the villagers attack. They drive the king's men out of town. The fire has started, and it spreads with terrifying speed. Within days, the counties of Essex and Kent are in open rebellion. But this is not a mindless, chaotic mob of starving peasants. That is a myth, created by terrified aristocrats. These are literate men. These are local constables, wealthy farmers, tradesmen, and battle-hardened veterans from the French wars. They are disciplined. They organise themselves into bands. They know exactly who their enemies are. They target the tax collectors. They target the corrupt judges. They break into the manors of the great lords and systematically burn the legal records, the manorial rolls that tie them to the land, the documents that record their servitude. They are erasing the feudal system with fire. A leader emerges in Kent, a man named Wat Tyler. We know almost nothing about his past, but we know he possessed an extraordinary charisma and military discipline. And beside him walks a radical priest named John Ball. John Ball has been preaching a dangerous, intoxicating theology for years. He taps into the deep, anti-clerical resentment of the age. He looks at the fat, wealthy bishops and the starving poor, and he asks a simple revolutionary question. He preaches it to the gathering armies in the fields. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? When the first man dug the earth and the first woman spun cloth, where were the lords and the dukes? He is telling the people that the entire class system is a man-made lie, that in the eyes of God they are all equal. It is a message that strikes the ruling class like a thunderbolt. In June 1381, these 2 massive columns of rebels, one from Essex, one from Kent, begin to march on London. Their slogan is brilliant in its simplicity: for King Richard and the true commons. They do not blame the 14-year-old king. They blame his corrupt advisors. They are marching to rescue the king from the parasites, ruining the country. The royal government is completely paralysed. The main army is away in Scotland or guarding the coast. The king and his ministers retreat into the massive stone walls of the Tower of London, watching in horror as the horizon fills with the smoke of burning manor houses. On June the 13th, the rebels arrive at the gates of London. The mayor tries to keep them out, but it is useless. The poor of London, the apprentices and the labourers who sympathise with the rebels, simply lower the drawbridge of London Bridge. They open the gates. Tens of thousands of armed, angry men pour into the capital of England. It is a night of absolute terror for the elite. The rebels do not loot blindly. Their violence is precise. They march straight to the Savoy Palace, the magnificent, sprawling home of John of Gaunt. They tear it apart. They smash his priceless furniture, tear up his tapestries, and burn the palace to the foundation. But they strictly forbid anyone from stealing. One man caught hiding a silver goblet is thrown into the flames. They are not thieves. They are executioners of justice. They open the prisons, freeing the inmates. They hunt down the lawyers and royal officials who drafted the taxes. The next day, June the 14th, the unthinkable happens. While the young King Richard rides out to meet a faction of the rebels at Mile End to hear their demands, another group storms the Tower of London. The ultimate fortress of royal power, a place that had never fallen, is breached by commoners. They burst into the royal apartments. They find the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was also the Chancellor responsible for the poll tax. They drag him out onto Tower Hill. They mock him, they beat him, and they behead him. They stick his head on a pike and parade it through the streets. The kingdom is teetering on the edge of total collapse. The entire social hierarchy is disintegrating. On June the 15th, the climax arrives. King Richard, just 14 years old, rides to Smithfield, just outside the city walls, to meet Wat Tyler for a final negotiation. The king is accompanied by a small, nervous group of retainers. Across the field stands Wat Tyler, backed by thousands of armed, hardened rebels. Tyler rides out to meet the king. He is arrogant. He acts not as a subject, but as an equal. He demands water to rinse his mouth. Emeritine give. He demands that all lordship be abolished, that the estates of the church be divided among the people, and that all men be made free. He is demanding the end of the medieval world. Tensions are razor thin. Words are exchanged. Insults are thrown by the king's men. Suddenly, violence erupts. The Mayor of London, enraged by Tyler's disrespect, draws his sword and slashes Tyler across the neck. Another of the king's squires runs him through. Wat Tyler falls from his horse, bleeding to death on the dirt. A roar of fury rises from the rebel army. Thousands of bows are drawn. They are about to slaughter the king and his entire retinue. The rebellion is seconds away from becoming a massacre. And in that moment, the 14-year-old King Richard II does something of unbelievable courage. He spurs his horse forward. He rides completely alone toward the wall of drawn bows. He raises his hand and shouts over the roar of the crowd. "Sirs, what is it you require? I am your captain. I am your king. Follow me." It is a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The rebels have been claiming all along that they are fighting times for times the king. Faced with the boy himself, bravely offering to lead them, their resolve shatters. They lower their bows. They follow him into a nearby field. The crisis is broken. The Mayor of London rushes back into the city, raises a militia, and surrounds the rebels. Without Wat Tyler, the movement is suddenly headless. Richard promises them pardons. He promises to abolish serfdom. He tells them to go home, and they do. They disperse. Of course, the promises are immediately broken. As soon as the danger passes, the royal armies sweep through the shires. The leaders are hunted down and hanged. John Ball is captured, drawn, and quartered. Richard allegedly tells a group of captured rebels, "Serfs you are, and serfs you shall remain." On paper, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is a failure, but in reality, it changes everything. The ruling class is deeply, permanently traumatized. They have looked out their windows and seen the terrifying power of the unified masses. They have seen their impregnable castles breached, and their highest ministers beheaded by the people they considered little more than animals. They will never try to levy a poll tax again. The fear of the mob permanently alters the psyche of the English elite. They realise that they can only push the commons so far. The slow death of serfdom accelerates. Landlords quietly begin to commute labour services into rent. They begin to negotiate rather than dictate. The fire in the shires is put out, but the ashes are smouldering. The common man has learned that he has power. And as King Richard grows from a brave boy into an arrogant, paranoid man, he will soon discover that peasants are not the only ones capable of tearing down a king. Chapter 5. The Shattered Crown. The boy who bravely rode out to face the rebel army at Smithfield did not remain a boy. King Richard II grew up, and he grew up with a dark, burning lesson seared into his mind. He had looked into the eyes of the angry mob. He had seen his highest ministers dragged from the tower and beheaded in the street. He knew, better than any king before him, that beneath the velvet cloaks and the golden crowns, royal power was incredibly fragile. So, he decided to make his power absolute. Imagine a man consumed by his own myth. Richard became utterly obsessed with the concept of the divine right of kings. He believed he was not just a politician managing a country, but God's anointed lieutenant on earth. His authority was sacred. His will was law. He changed the way the court functioned. He demanded to be addressed with a brand new, exalted title, Your Majesty. He required those who approached him to fall to their knees. He commissioned glorious, ethereal portraits of himself surrounded by angels. He built a private army, a fiercely loyal retinue drawn from the distant, rugged lands of Cheshire and North Wales, wearing his personal badge of the White Hart. He was creating a cult of personality, a magnificent, terrifying theatre of absolute power. But the old aristocratic families of England, the battle-hardened lords, the earls and dukes who owned massive estates across the country, looked at Richard and did not see a god. They saw an arrogant, insecure tyrant surrounded by flattering parasites. The friction between the king and his nobles became unbearable. In 1388, a group of powerful barons, known as the Lords Appellant, actively rebelled. They brought armies to London. They systematically purged the king's closest friends, executing them or driving them into exile in a brutal assembly known as the Merciless Parliament. Richard was forced to sit on his throne and watch his favourite advisors be condemned to death. He was humiliated. He was stripped of his actual power, reduced to a puppet in his own court. But Richard had his grandfather's patience, and he had a very long memory. For nearly 10 years, Richard played the role of the perfect cooperative king. He grew into his 20s. He brokered a long truce with France, ending the endless drain of the war. He travelled to Ireland, reasserting English authority with a massive, expensive military campaign. He seemed to have put the past behind him, but he was only waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In 1397, the mask finally came off. The king's revenge was cold, calculated, and breathtakingly ruthless. Without warning, Richard turned on the men who had humiliated him a decade earlier. He invited the Earl of Warwick to a banquet, dined with him, and then suddenly had him arrested and exiled. He had the Earl of Arundel dragged before Parliament and beheaded. He arranged for his own uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, to be quietly smothered to death in a prison in Calais. And then he turned his eyes to his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of the immensely wealthy, widely hated John of Gaunt. Richard engineered a political crisis, forcing Henry Bolingbroke into a 10-year exile. The king was completely untethered. The last 2 years of his reign are recorded by historians simply as the Tyranny. He ruled by fear. He confiscated lands, handed out massive estates to his loyal favourites, and forced the Pope to threaten excommunication against anyone who dared speak against the crown. He even secured a promise from the French king to send an army to crush his own English subjects if they rebelled. He had won. He was absolute. But then, Richard made a fatal miscalculation. A mistake so profound it would drown England in blood for the next 100 years. In early 1399, the old Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, finally died. By the sacred laws of inheritance, his vast estates, the largest, wealthiest network of lands in the entire kingdom, should have passed to his exiled son, Henry Bolingbroke. But Richard looked at that wealth, and he looked at the threat his cousin posed, and with a stroke of a pen, he cancelled the inheritance. He seized the Lancastrian estates for the crown and declared Henry Bolingbroke's exile permanent. Think about what this meant to the rest of the nobility. In the medieval world, property was everything. It was your identity, your power, your legacy. If the king could arbitrarily disinherit the greatest duke in the land, if he could rip away a family's ancient birthright simply because he wanted to, then no one was safe. The fundamental social contract of the realm had been violated. In May of 1399, feeling completely secure in his terrifying power, King Richard sailed across the Irish Sea to put down a minor rebellion in Ireland. He left his kingdom wide open. Henry Bolingbroke did not stay in Paris. In July, he landed on the northern coast of England with a small band of followers. He announced that he had only come to reclaim his stolen father's lands. He claimed he did not want the crown. But as Henry marched southward, the deep, silent hatred for King Richard's tyranny finally broke. The great northern families, the Percys and the Nevilles, rode out to join him. Commoners, exhausted by the king's erratic cruelty, flocked to his banner. By the time Henry reached the Midlands, his small band had swelled into a massive, unstoppable army. The king's support evaporated like mist. His ministers fled. His castles surrendered without firing an arrow. When Richard finally rushed back from Ireland, landing in Wales, he found a kingdom that had completely abandoned him. He wandered the Welsh mountains, his army deserting him in the night. He was isolated, terrified, and utterly alone. He was eventually lured out of hiding and taken prisoner by Henry's men. The image of Richard's fall is one of the most haunting in English history. He is brought to London not as a glittering divine monarch, but as a broken captive, riding on a miserable, undersized horse, while the crowds of London, the same crowds he had once faced down as a boy, jeered and threw garbage at him. He was locked inside the Tower of London. The very fortress his ancestors had built to project invincible power became his final prison. In September of 1399, a grim, unprecedented ceremony took place. Under immense psychological pressure, weeping and likely trembling with fear, King Richard II was forced to read a document of abdication. He renounced his divine right. He gave up the crown. A parliament was quickly assembled to officially depose him, charging him with 33 articles of tyranny, perjury, and incompetence. The crown was empty, but here is the crack in the foundation that would eventually bring the whole house down. Since the year 1216, the crown had always passed smoothly to the king's eldest son, but Richard had no children. According to strict bloodlines, the true heir was a 7-year-old boy named the Earl of March, but a 7-year-old boy cannot control a fractured, traumatized kingdom. Henry Bolingbroke was 33. He had the army, he had the wealth, he had the momentum. Henry stepped forward and claimed the throne by right of descent, and by the grace of God, he was crowned King Henry IV. The paperwork was drawn up. The lawyers made their arguments, but no amount of legal twisting could hide the brutal truth of what had just happened. It was a coup d'etat. A king had been overthrown by his own subject. The magic was gone. The divine, untouchable aura of the monarchy had been shattered. It proved that a crown was not bestowed by God. It was a piece of metal that could be taken by force, kept by force, and lost by force. A few months later, the deposed King Richard died mysteriously in the freezing dungeons of Pontefract Castle in the north. He was likely starved to death to prevent any future rebellions in his name. Henry IV sat on the throne, the first king of the House of Lancaster. He had won the ultimate prize, but he had inherited a poisoned chalice. He would spend the rest of his life fighting rebellions, looking over his shoulder, constantly justifying a crown he had stolen. And he had opened a terrifying door, because if a cousin could violently take the throne today, what was to stop another cousin from doing the exact same thing tomorrow? The seeds of the most destructive, blood-soaked family feud in English history had just been planted in the fertile, blood-stained soil of the royal court. The Plantagenet dynasty had torn itself in half, and the red and white roses were preparing to bloom. Chapter 6. From Agincourt to Ashes. The usurper king, Henry IV, spent his entire 14-year reign looking over his shoulder. He wore the crown, but it rested on a bed of thorns. He fought off rebellions, assassination plots, and the constant gnawing guilt of having starved his own cousin to death in a cold dungeon. When he finally died in 1413, physically exhausted and suffering from a disfiguring skin disease, it seemed the curse of the shattered crown would consume the House of Lancaster. But Henry IV left behind a son, and this son was not a politician. He was a warlord. His name was Henry V, and he is perhaps the most brilliantly effective, terrifyingly focused monarch in English history. Picture him. He is lean. He is athletic. The right side of his face bears a deep, jagged scar from an arrow that struck him when he was just 16, fighting rebels in the Welsh mountains. He is a man who understands that the only way to heal a fractured, treacherous nobility at home is to point their swords at someone else. He looks across the Channel. He sees a France that is currently ruled by a king, suffering from severe mental illness, a country tearing itself apart in a bitter civil war between rival dukes. It is the perfect target. Henry decides to finish what Edward III started. He will not just raid France, he will conquer it. In the late summer of 1415, Henry sails his army across the sea. The campaign begins with a grueling siege at Harfleur. It is successful, but the cost is horrific. A silent killer sweeps through the English camp. Dysentery. By October, Henry's army is a shadow of its former self. They are sick, they are starving, they are exhausted. They are marching in the freezing autumn rain, desperately trying to reach the safety of English-held Calais. But the French have finally mobilised. A massive army, commanded by the greatest nobles of France, intercepts them. The date is October the 25th, the Feast of St. Crispin. The place is a narrow strip of freshly ploughed land flanked by dense woods, a place called Agincourt. Close your eyes and listen to the rain. It has been pouring for days. The ploughed earth has turned into a thick, sucking soup of mud. The English are hopelessly outnumbered. Perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 men, mostly common archers, pale and weak from disease. Across the field, blocking their path to safety, are perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 fresh, heavily armoured French troops. The French are so confident, so eager for the glory of slaughtering the English king, that they are laughing and drinking in their camp the night before. But Henry is cold, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. He knows the mud is his greatest ally. When the French heavy cavalry and dismounted knights begin their charge, they are forced into the narrow funnel between the woods. The mud clings to their steel boots. They sink up to their knees. The sheer crush of their own numbers makes it impossible to swing a sword or even breathe properly. And then, the English longbowmen open fire. It is Cressy all over again, but infinitely more brutal. The archers, many of them fighting without armour, some even fighting naked from the waist down because of the dysentery, unleash a storm of bodkin arrows. The French attack collapses into a horrifying pile of screaming horses, suffocating men, and drowning knights. Men are crushed to death by the weight of their own comrades before a single English arrow strikes them. When the French line falters, the lightly armed English archers drop their bows, draw their daggers and lead mallets, and sprint lightly across the mud. They leap onto the trapped, exhausted French aristocrats, slipping thin blades through the visors of their helmets. It is an absolute massacre. The flower of French nobility is wiped out in a single afternoon. Thousands of Frenchmen lie dead in the mud. The English losses are miraculously light. Agincourt transforms Henry V into a living god in the eyes of his people. He returns to London to a hysterical, messianic reception. Parliament falls over itself to grant him massive taxes. Tax. The country is completely united in a fever of aggressive patriotism. Over the next 5 years, Henry ruthlessly grinds down French resistance. He does not just raid, he colonises. He captures Normandy. He takes town after town. In 1420, the unimaginable happens. The French, utterly broken and divided, sign the Treaty of Troyes. The treaty stipulates that Henry V will marry the French king's daughter, and more importantly, it declares that upon the mad French king's death, Henry and his heirs will become the kings of France. It is the absolute zenith of the English medieval empire. The two kingdoms are to be united under one crown. The great gamble has paid off. Henry has won the 100 Years' War. But history is rarely a story of permanent victories. History is a pendulum, and just when it swings to the highest point of glory, it is suddenly, violently released. 2 years later, in 1422, Henry V is at the peak of his power. He is managing a vast, dual monarchy. And then, he drinks some contaminated water. Dysentery, the same disease that plagued his men at Agincourt, takes hold of the king. The greatest warrior of the age, the man who brought France to its knees, wastes away in a matter of weeks. He dies at the age of 35. It is a catastrophic blow, and it is made infinitely worse by the succession. Henry leaves behind a single heir. King Henry VI is 9 months old. An infant is now the King of England and France. For the next 2 decades, a council of proud, ambitious noblemen tries to hold the empire together, and for a while, they manage it. The king's uncle, the Duke of Bedford, is a capable military commander, but maintaining an occupation in a hostile country is a financial black hole. And then the French find a miracle. In 1429, a teenage peasant girl named Joan of Arc arrives at the French court. She claims to hear the voices of saints telling her to drive the English out. She provides exactly what the French need, a massive, terrifying surge of religious nationalism. The English are pushed back. The momentum shifts. As the baby king grows into a man, the true tragedy of the House of Lancaster reveals itself. Henry VI is nothing like his father. He does not like war. He does not like jousting. He is intensely pious, deeply gentle, and completely ill-equipped for the brutal, unforgiving politics of the 15th century. He is a man who should have been a monk, but by an accident of birth, he is forced to be a warlord. He hates the bloodshed in France. He wants peace at any cost. In 1445, he marries a fierce, politically astute French princess named Margaret of Anjou. To secure the marriage and a brief truce, Henry secretly agrees to hand over the hard-won territory of Maine back to the French. When the English nobility finds out, they are apoplectic. English blood was spilled to take that land, and their soft, weak king simply gives it away. The French smell the blood in the water. They know the English treasury is empty. They know the English king is weak. In 1449, the French launch a massive, coordinated assault to take back Normandy. And they bring a new, terrifying weapon to the battlefield. Gunpowder. The era of the longbow is ending. The era of artillery has begun. French cannons smash the ancient stone walls of the English castles. The French army, now highly disciplined and modernised, sweeps the English out of northern France with shocking speed. By 1450, Normandy is gone. The English public is stunned. Soldiers return home mutilated, unpaid, and furious. They blame the king's corrupt advisors. A massive rebellion breaks out in Kent, led by a man named Jack Cade. The rebels march on London, demanding the heads of the ministers who lost France. The government is paralysed, deeply unpopular, and functionally bankrupt. But the final fatal blow is yet to come. Deep in the southwest of France lies Gascony, the jewel of the wine trade. It has been English territory for 300 years. The people there consider themselves loyal subjects of the English crown. But in 1453, the French artillery train rolls south. At a place called Castillon, the English commander launches a desperate, outdated cavalry charge against a fortified French artillery encampment. It is a slaughter. The English are blown to pieces by concentrated cannon fire. Gascony falls. The great Continental Empire built by Edward III and Henry V collapses into dust. Aside from the small port of Calais, the English are entirely expelled from Europe. The 100 Years' War is over, and England has lost. The news reaches London in August of 1453. It travels to the Royal Hunting Lodge, where King Henry VI is staying. When they tell the king that Gascony is gone, something inside his mind simply snaps. He does not rage. He does not weep. He stops speaking. He stops moving. The King of England falls into a complete catatonic stupor. For 17 months, he sits in a chair, staring blankly at the wall. He cannot dress himself. He cannot feed himself. He does not even react when they bring his newborn son and lay the child in his arms. The realm is completely paralysed. The king is a living ghost. The treasury is empty. The streets are full of angry, unemployed veterans holding weapons. And in the shadows of the court, the great noble families look at the vacant throne, and they look at each other. They have spent the last 100 years fighting the French. Now, they have no one left to fight but themselves. The Duke of York, the richest man in the kingdom, takes a step forward. Queen Margaret, fiercely protecting her newborn son's inheritance, steps in to block him. The foreign war is dead. The Cousins' War is about to begin. Chapter 7. The Cousins' War. The king is sitting in his chair. He does not speak. He does not blink. He is staring into a terrible, empty void. It is the autumn of 1453. England has just lost its continental empire. The treasury is utterly exhausted, and the mind of King Henry VI has completely collapsed. The royal court is paralysed. Without a functioning king, the intricate, delicate machinery of medieval government grinds to a terrifying halt. There is no one to settle land disputes. There is no one to enforce the law. And in this vacuum of power, the great aristocratic families of England begin to arm themselves. To understand the nightmare that is about to unfold, you have to understand the monstrous system the nobility has built over the last century. Historians call it bastard feudalism. The great lords do not just own land, they own massive, private armies. They give their retainers badges, a silver boar, a bear and ragged staff, a white rose. In return for wearing the badge, the lord protects the retainer from the law. It is a mafia state, and the godfathers are looking at the empty throne. The wealthiest of them all is Richard, the Duke of York. He is a proud, capable man, and crucially, he has a legitimate blood claim to the throne, a claim arguably stronger than the comatose King Henry's. York steps forward and is named protector of the realm. But across the chessboard stands Queen Margaret of Anjou. She is fierce, she is politically brilliant, and she has just given birth to a son, the Prince of Wales. She looks at the Duke of York, and she sees a man trying to steal her baby's inheritance. When King Henry miraculously wakes from his catatonic state a year later, the Queen strikes. She whispers in her husband's ear. She systematically strips the Duke of York of all his power and hands control of the government to her own favourites. York realises he is being pushed into a corner. If he submits, he will likely be executed for treason. If he fights, it is civil war. He chooses to fight. The Wars of the Roses begin. It is not a war of ideals. It is not a war for the soul of the nation. It is a brutal, cynical, dynastic meat grinder. A blood feud between cousins that will wipe out entire generations of the English nobility. The violence escalates rapidly. At the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, the Duke of York is trapped by a Lancastrian army. He is killed. The Queen's forces chop off his head, stick a mocking paper crown on it, and spike it above the gates of the city of York. Margaret thinks she has won. She has cut off the head of the serpent. But the Duke of York has a son. His name is Edward, the Earl of March. He is 18 years old. He is 6 feet 4 inches tall, breathtakingly handsome, and unlike his father, he is a terrifyingly brilliant military commander. When Edward hears of his father's death, he does not seek a truce. He seeks annihilation. He marches his army north to meet the Lancastrian forces. They meet on Palm Sunday, 1461, near a small village called Towton. Listen to the weather. It is not a beautiful spring day. It is the middle of a screaming, freezing blizzard. The two largest armies ever assembled on English soil, perhaps 80,000 men in total, face each other in the blinding, driving snow. The wind is blowing directly into the faces of the Lancastrian army. Edward's archers use this to their advantage. They fire their arrows high into the storm. The wind carries them far beyond their normal range, plunging them into the blinded Lancastrian ranks. When the Lancastrians try to fire back, the wind stops their arrows dead in the air, leaving them to fall harmlessly short into the snow. Out of arrows and bleeding heavily, the Lancastrians have no choice but to charge blindly into the blizzard. What follows is the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Isles. For 10 hours, the two armies hack at each other with swords, poleaxes and warhammers. The snow turns into a horrifying, slippery slush of crimson. Men are fighting hand to hand, exhausted, slipping on the freezing blood and the severed limbs of their friends. When the Lancastrian line finally breaks, a panicked retreat turns into a massacre. Thousands of men try to flee across the nearby River Cock. The river is swollen, with freezing meltwater. The men in heavy armour drown, sinking to the bottom. So many die in the water that the bodies form a literal bridge of human corpses, and the surviving Yorkist soldiers run across the backs of the dead to continue the slaughter on the other side. 28,000 men die at Towton. It is an unimaginable loss of life. Edward marches into London in triumph. He is crowned King Edward IV. The House of York has taken the throne. The old king, Henry VI, is captured a few years later and locked away in the Tower of London. For a moment, it seems the nightmare is over. Edward is a popular, charismatic king. He brings stability. He encourages trade. But the poison of betrayal runs deep in the Plantagenet blood. Edward's greatest ally, the man who helped him win the crown, is the Earl of Warwick. History remembers him as Warwick the Kingmaker. Warwick is immensely powerful, and he expects to be the shadow ruler behind the young, handsome king. But Edward is not a puppet. He secretly marries a beautiful, relatively low-born widow named Elizabeth Woodville, elevating her massive family to positions of power and completely ignoring Warwick's diplomatic plans. Warwick is humiliated, and a humiliated medieval baron is a very dangerous thing. In a breathtaking act of treason, the Kingmaker turns on his king. Warwick flees to France and makes a deal with his oldest, bitterest enemy, the exiled Lancastrian queen, Margaret of Anjou. They invade England. Edward IV is caught off guard and forced to flee the country in the middle of the night, escaping to Burgundy with nothing but the clothes on his back. Warwick marches into the Tower of London. He takes the fragile, mentally broken Henry VI out of his cell, dresses him in velvet, and props him back on the throne like a stuffed doll. It is a cynical, absurd puppet show. But Edward IV is a warrior, and warriors do not stay in exile. In the spring of 1471, Edward returns. He lands in Yorkshire, gathers an army, and marches south. He meets Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. It is Easter Sunday. This time, the weather brings a suffocating, incredibly thick fog. The visibility is zero. The armies stumble into each other in the mist. The fighting is chaotic and terrifying. Because of the fog, one of Warwick's commanders mistakes the badge of an ally for the badge of Edward's men. Friendly fire erupts. Treason is shouted. The Lancastrian line dissolves in panic. Warwick the Kingmaker tries to flee, weighed down by his heavy plate armour. He is caught in the woods and hacked to pieces by Edward's men. A few weeks later, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward intercepts Queen Margaret and her son. The Lancastrian prince is killed on the battlefield. Margaret is captured. Edward returns to London as the undisputed master of England. That very night, the old broken King Henry VI mysteriously dies in the Tower of London. The official report says he died of pure displeasure and melancholy. And, quote, "The reality is a dagger in the dark. The House of Lancaster is extinct." King Edward rules in relative peace for the next 12 years. He builds magnificent chapels, patronises the new printing presses, and grows comfortably fat. The bloody Game of Thrones seems to be permanently settled, but the Wheel of Fortune has one final horrifying turn to make. In the spring of 1483, Edward IV suddenly falls ill. Within days, he is dead. He is only 40 years old. He leaves behind a 12-year-old son, Edward V. Once again, a child is king, and once again the sharks begin to circle. The late king's brother is Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. Richard is a seasoned, ruthless military commander who has controlled the north of England for years. He looks at the young boy king. He looks at the boy's powerful Woodville relatives, whom he despises, and Richard decides to strike. He intercepts the boy king on his way to London. He executes the Woodville guardians without a trial. He takes the 12-year-old Edward V and his younger brother, 9-year-old Richard, and places them in the Tower of London, supposedly for their own protection before the coronation. The coronation never happens. Richard of Gloucester launches a massive propaganda campaign, declaring that his dead brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, and therefore the two boys in the tower are illegitimate bastards. Richard takes the crown for himself. He becomes King Richard III, and what of the boys, the princes in the tower? They are seen playing in the courtyard in the early summer. Then they are moved to the inner apartments. Then they are seen less and less behind the barred windows. By the autumn of 1483, they disappear completely. They are never seen alive again. The shadow of their suspected murder hangs over Richard's reign like a dark, suffocating shroud. Richard III has secured his throne through naked, unapologetic ruthlessness. But a crown, stolen in the dark, cannot withstand the light. His brutal methods alienate the surviving nobility. Paranoia grips the court. Rebellions begin to simmer. And across the English Channel, in the court of France, a young man is watching. His name is Henry Tudor. He is a Welsh exile. He has spent the last 14 years running for his life. His claim to the English throne is incredibly weak, derived through a line of illegitimate children of John of Gaunt. In any normal era, he would be a nobody. But this is not a normal era. The Plantagenet family has practically exterminated itself. Henry Tudor is the very last drop of Lancastrian blood left in the world. In August of 1485, Henry sails across the Channel. He lands in Wales with a small army of French mercenaries and political exiles. He marches eastward into England, picking up supporters who are disgusted by Richard III's regime. Richard mobilises a massive royal army to crush this final rebellion. They meet on a field in Leicestershire, Bosworth Field. August the 22nd, 1485. Richard's army is much larger, but the loyalty of his men is brittle. Some of the most powerful lords on the battlefield, the Stanley family, hold their forces back, waiting to see who will win before committing to the fight. When the battle begins, Richard sees an opportunity. He spots Henry Tudor's banner in the distance, surrounded by a small bodyguard. Richard III makes a breathtakingly bold, desperate gamble. He gathers his elite household cavalry and charges directly across the battlefield, aiming straight for Henry Tudor. He wants to cut the head off the snake himself. The charge is terrifying in its ferocity. Richard crashes into Henry's lines. He kills Henry's standard-bearer. He is within sword's reach of Henry Tudor. But then, the Stanleys finally make their move. They plunge into the flank of the king's cavalry. Richard is surrounded. His horse is killed beneath him. He refuses to flee. He fights on foot, swinging a battle-axe, screaming, "Treason! Treason!" until he is overwhelmed by a crush of Welsh pikemen. The last Plantagenet king of England goes down swinging. He is hacked to death in the mud. His crown, knocked from his helmet during the chaotic struggle, rolls into a hawthorn bush. It is found and placed on the head of Henry Tudor. The long, bloody nightmare is finally over. The cousins' war has burned itself out. The old, arrogant nobility of the Middle Ages lies dead on fields like Towton, Barnet and Bosworth. The Plantagenet era is dead. The Tudor era has begun. And from the ashes of this apocalyptic century, a new, thoroughly modern nation is about to rise. Chapter 8. The Dawn of Englishness. The dust settles on Bosworth Field. The summer of 1485 draws to a close. King Richard III lies dead in the mud, his crown plucked from a hawthorn bush. The great, ancient aristocratic families, the proud lords who had treated England like their own personal chessboard for over a century, have practically exterminated themselves. Their blood has soaked the fields of Towton, Barnet and Bosworth. Their mighty castles stand quiet, but while the kings and the dukes were busy slaughtering each other over the shape of a crown, something extraordinary was happening in the background. The real England was quietly getting to work. You see, the true wealth of a nation is rarely forged on a battlefield. It is not created by taking it from someone else with a sword. It is created by building. It is created by trade. It is the quiet, relentless compounding of value over time. And as the 15th century unfolded, the people of England began to understand this. Let us turn our eyes away from the bloody courts of Westminster and look at the shires, the deep green valleys of the West Country, the flat, windswept plains of East Anglia. The economic foundation of the country was fundamentally shifting. For centuries, England had simply exported raw wool to Europe. But now, they were changing the game. They were keeping the wool at home and weaving it into cloth themselves. Listen to the sound of the new era. It is not the clash of steel, it is the steady, rhythmic thumping of the fulling mills, powered by the fast-flowing streams of the countryside. New towns are rising from obscurity. Halifax, Leeds, Bradford, they are becoming engines of industry. Bristol, sitting on the edge of the Western Sea, swells with the profits of the cloth trade and the wine imported from Bordeaux. And then there is London. London is becoming a monster. It is the only truly massive city in the realm, drawing in immigrants from every corner of the island. It is a city of 50,000 people, a bustling, chaotic, incredibly wealthy hub of international trade. This is the birth of the English merchant class, and these merchants operate on a completely different philosophy than the old feudal lords. They are deeply rational. They understand human nature. As a wise man might say, "Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome." The Black Death had shattered the old chains of serfdom. It had given the surviving peasants the ultimate incentive, the ability to keep the fruits of their own labour. When you give a man the freedom to earn a higher wage, to rent his own land, to invest his surplus, you unleash an unstoppable economic force. These new farmers, these yeomen and merchants, are not hoarding gold in castle vaults to pay for foreign wars. They are investing it. They are lending it. They are keeping meticulous ledgers. And to keep those ledgers, to run this massive new commercial machine, they need a tool. They need a language. For 300 years, since the Norman conquest, the language of power in England was French. The language of God was Latin. English was considered the vulgar tongue of the conquered, the language of the dirt and the plough. But a merchant in London trying to arrange a shipment of cloth with a weaver in Yorkshire cannot do business in aristocratic French. The government bureaucracy, expanding rapidly to manage the complex logistics of war and taxation, cannot function effectively if its clerks cannot communicate with the local sheriffs. The practical necessity of commerce demands a unified voice. Slowly, inevitably, the English language rises from the dirt. It absorbs the vocabulary of French law and Latin administration, evolving into something incredibly rich, flexible, and powerful. But there is a problem. The English spoken in the north is practically a foreign language to a man from the south. The dialects are fractured. The solution comes from the sheer gravitational pull of London. As thousands of people migrate from the East Midlands and the surrounding shires into the capital looking for work, their dialects rub against each other. They blend, they compromise, and out of this melting pot emerges a standardized, highly expressive form of English. It is the language of the Conqueror replaced by the language of the people, and it is waiting for a voice to give it a soul. Enter a man named Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer is not a lord. He is the son of a London wine merchant. He grows up in the bustling streets, navigating the complex worlds of royal service and commercial trade. He understands the high court, and he understands the tavern. In the late 14th century, Chaucer makes a radical decision. He does not write his great masterpiece in French. He writes it in the everyday English of the Midlands. He writes the Canterbury Tales. When you read Chaucer, you are not reading about mythical knights slaying dragons. You are reading about a drunken miller, a pragmatic merchant, plus a worldly wife of Bath who has buried 5 husbands and is looking for a 6th. You are hearing the authentic, unapologetic voices of the new middle class. Chaucer's genius proves that English is not just a language for keeping accounts. It is a language capable of breathtaking poetry, deep psychological insight, and razor-sharp humour. He captures the very essence of the emerging English identity. And as literacy spreads, as more and more laymen learn to read and write to run their businesses, this English literature begins to circulate. It is read in the quiet moments of the evening, in the solid stone houses of the new wealthy farmers, and in the bustling guild halls of the cities. This newfound wealth and this burgeoning national pride must find a physical expression. If the symbol of the old feudal England was the grim, impenetrable stone castle, the symbol of the new England is something entirely different. It is the parish church. Across the country, wealthy clothiers, merchants, and local guilds begin pouring their immense profits into their local churches. They are not building defensive walls. They are building monuments to God and monuments to their own success. They develop a style of architecture that is uniquely, exclusively English. It is called the Perpendicular Gothic. Imagine walking into one of these magnificent structures, St. Mary Redcliffe in Bristol, or the great churches of the Cotswolds. The heavy, dark arches of the past are gone. The walls seem to vanish, replaced by massive, towering panels of stained glass. The lines draw your eyes straight up, soaring toward heaven. And above you, the crowning glory of English craftsmanship, the intricate, mesmerizing geometry of the carved wooden roofs and the delicate stone fan vaults. It is light. It is space. It is a breathtaking display of confidence. These buildings are not commissioned by a single, terrifying king. They are financed by the community. They are the physical proof that the wealth of the nation is no longer hoarded at the top. It has spread into the roots of society. As we reach the end of the 15th century, the nightmare of the past 200 years begins to look very different. To the people who lived through it, the 14th and 15th centuries must have felt like the end of the world. They endured the apocalypse of the Black Death. They suffered the grinding, endless taxation of the 100 Years' War. They watched the divine illusion of the monarchy shatter as cousins butchered each other for the crown. But history is a master of paradox. The deepest darkness is often the crucible of the greatest transformations. The hammer of war and the anvil of plague did not destroy England. They shattered the rigid, oppressive shell of the medieval world. The catastrophic loss of life broke the chains of serfdom, allowing the lowest labourers to negotiate their worth and begin accumulating real wealth. The relentless financial pressure of the wars forced the kings to negotiate with Parliament, laying the early groundwork for democratic accountability. And the violent self-destruction of the ancient nobility cleared the way for the pragmatic, fiercely independent merchant class to rise and build the economic engine of the modern era. The kings who fought so desperately for power are gone, their bones resting in quiet stone tombs. Their absolute authority proved to be a fragile illusion, but what they left behind, unintentionally, is permanent. A unified language that would one day circle the globe, a resilient middle class built on the compounding value of trade and industry, and a deep, unshakable sense of national identity. The true legacy of these dark centuries is not the crown, it is the people who survived them. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the shadows of the Middle Ages. Sleep well, and I will see you next time as we open another file, decoding the human trajectory. Good night.